episode 55, titled Name Resolution and Relay Concepts, we're going to connect a few ideas that show up in real environments and in exam questions because they blend networking, trust, and authentication in a way that creates credential capture and reuse opportunities. The big theme is name resolution confusion, where systems ask for a destination by name and end up talking to the wrong place, often without anyone noticing until something strange happens. When an attacker can influence those name lookups, they can redirect requests, provoke authentication attempts, and sometimes reuse that authentication in ways that feel like a magic trick until you see the trust assumptions underneath. This is not about breaking cryptography. It is about bending routine behavior so that systems authenticate where they should not. The goal in this episode is to understand the concepts, recognize the signals, and think in a safe, professional validation mindset.
Name resolution can be described simply as the way devices turn names into directions. A user or system wants to reach something like a server name, a share name, or an internal service label, and it asks the environment, "Where is this?" The response is a direction, such as an address or route that tells the device where to send traffic next. The key point is that name resolution is a trust mechanism because devices generally accept the answer and proceed without treating it as suspicious. In well-designed environments, resolution is controlled and predictable, but in many networks, multiple resolution mechanisms exist and not all of them are equally protected. When name resolution is messy, attackers can exploit that messiness because the device is trying to be helpful, not skeptical. Once you understand resolution as asking for directions, it becomes easy to see how giving the wrong directions leads to the wrong destination. Spoofing concepts fit naturally into that metaphor because spoofing is the attacker answering first and redirecting the request. If a device is asking, "Where is this name?" and the attacker can respond faster or more convincingly than the legitimate resolver, the device may accept the attacker's answer. That wrong answer can point the device to an attacker-controlled host or to a place that enables interception and manipulation. Spoofing works best in environments where broadcasts, weak trust boundaries, or permissive local network behavior allow an attacker to inject responses without strong validation. The risk is not only misrouting traffic, but also provoking the device to initiate authentication to the attacker's chosen destination. That is where credential-related impact often begins, because systems frequently authenticate automatically to services they believe are legitimate.
Relay concepts are different from spoofing because the attacker is not simply redirecting to a fake endpoint and stopping there. They are forwarding authentication to a real service.
In a relay situation, the attacker sits in the middle of an authentication exchange and uses the victim's authentication attempt as a token to access another service that will accept it. The attacker may not learn the user's password in the traditional sense, but they can still gain access because they can present the authentication material to a target service in real time. This is why relay can be so confusing to teams, because it looks like the user authenticated to something they never intended, yet no obvious password guessing occurred. Relay depends on protocols and configurations that allow authentication to be reused or forwarded without sufficient binding to the original endpoint. Conceptually, it is less steal the secret and more borrow the authentication at the moment it happens. Some protocols and configurations trust too much, and that overtrust is what allows unintended authentication to occur. In many enterprise environments, systems are designed for convenience, meaning they will attempt to authenticate automatically to access resources, discover services, or connect to network shares. If the authentication mechanism does not strongly bind the authentication to a specific service identity, or if it permits a middle party to forward the authentication, then an attacker can exploit that flexibility. Overtrust also appears when systems accept name resolution answers from untrusted sources, or when they allow weak fallbacks that favor connectivity over security. Another trust issue is when signing requirements or mutual validation controls are not enforced, making it easier for an attacker to sit between parties. The key is that these attacks are often enabled by defaults and compatibility choices, rather than a single glaring misconfiguration. When you see "it just works" behavior, you should consider whether that convenience is built on trust that can be abused. Common signals are valuable because these attacks can feel invisible until someone notices odd behavior.
Unexpected prompts are one signal, such as a user being asked to authenticate when they were not trying to access anything new.
Repeated authentication attempts are another, especially when the user believes they already signed in, which can indicate that the system is being redirected or that authentication is failing and being retried. Access anomalies can also appear, such as log entries showing a workstation authenticating to an unfamiliar host, or a user account accessing a service at unusual times or from unusual endpoints. In some cases, users report intermittent connectivity issues to familiar resources, which can be consistent with name resolution instability or manipulation. These signals are not proof of spoofing or relay by themselves, but they are the kinds of clues that should trigger careful investigation. The best responders treat the signals as hypotheses and then look for supporting network evidence.
Segmentation and hardening reduce these opportunities because they reduce who can influence name resolution traffic, and they increase the validation requirements around authentication. Segmentation limits shared network exposure, which reduces the attacker's ability to inject responses or position themselves where they can observe and manipulate local traffic. Hardening includes enforcing secure resolution paths, restricting or disabling weak resolution mechanisms, and ensuring that trusted resolvers are the only sources of accepted answers. Hardening also includes strengthening authentication requirements, such as enforcing signing and validation behaviors that prevent an attacker from relaying or replaying authentication material easily. When these controls are in place, the network becomes less chatty and less trusting of arbitrary answers, which is exactly what you want. The strategic mindset is to reduce ambient trust and reduce the number of places where a hostile actor can pretend to be helpful. Now consider a scenario where a workstation authenticates to an unexpected host, because that is a practical way these concepts surface during an engagement. You review logs and notice that a user workstation initiated authentication to a host name that the user does not recognize, and the timing coincides with the user trying to reach a common internal resource. The clue is that the workstation was looking for something by name and ended up authenticating elsewhere, which suggests name resolution confusion or manipulation. If the unexpected host appears on a local segment and the authentication happened without a deliberate user action, the case for spoofing-driven redirection becomes stronger. If, shortly after that authentication, the same user account is recorded accessing another service unexpectedly, you may suspect relay, because authentication was forwarded to a legitimate target. The point is not to jump to conclusions, but to see how the observed chain can map to either spoofing or relay, depending on what evidence you find next.
Safe validation here means confirming traffic patterns and authorization boundaries rather than attempting aggressive active testing. You confirm which resolution method produced the answer and whether the answer came from a trusted resolver or from an untrusted source on a shared segment. You confirm whether the unexpected host was reachable and whether it responded in a way consistent with receiving authentication attempts, using non-disruptive observation where possible. You also confirm authorization boundaries, such as which services would accept the authentication material, and whether signing or validation requirements are enforced. The goal is to build a defensible story about what is happening on the network without provoking more authentication attempts or creating additional exposure. Safe validation also includes protecting users by reducing the chance that they continue to authenticate to the wrong destination while investigation proceeds. When you validate this way, you convert a confusing symptom into a set of observable facts that can be mitigated. A common pitfall is confusing relay behavior with brute force password guessing, because both can involve repeated authentication events and unusual access patterns. Brute force typically involves many attempts and a guessing pattern, while relay involves leveraging legitimate authentication attempts in real time without needing to guess the password. If you misclassify relay as brute force, you may focus remediation on password policies and lockouts while leaving the underlying trust and signing weaknesses intact. Another pitfall is assuming that because you did not see password failures, nothing dangerous happened, when relay can succeed without generating the same failure patterns. The right approach is to look at the shape of the authentication events, the network paths, and the presence of unusual name resolution answers rather than relying on a single interpretation. When you separate these behaviors correctly, your mitigations become much more targeted and effective.
Quick wins often involve disabling weak protocols and enforcing strong signing requirements, because those steps reduce the feasibility of spoofing-driven authentication capture and relay-based reuse. Disabling weak mechanisms reduces the number of ways a device can be tricked into trusting an unvalidated answer or accepting a loosely bound authentication exchange. Enforcing signing and stricter validation makes it harder for a middle party to forward authentication material in a way that a legitimate service will accept. These quick wins are high leverage because they address the trust assumptions that make the attacks work rather than relying solely on user behavior or monitoring. They also tend to reduce noisy authentication issues, which provides operational benefit and can increase organizational willingness to adopt them. In practice, these controls are most effective when paired with segmentation that reduces who can influence local resolution behavior.
Reporting should be clear about cause, observed behavior, and recommended controls, because these topics can sound abstract if you do not connect them to what was actually seen. You describe the observed behavior, such as name lookups returning unexpected destinations, workstations authenticating to unfamiliar hosts, or authentication being used to access services the user did not intend. You describe the plausible cause in a grounded way, such as name resolution responses being accepted from untrusted sources, or authentication being reusable in a way that permits relay. You recommend controls that directly address the weakness, such as restricting resolution sources, disabling weak resolution mechanisms, enforcing signing and validation requirements, and tightening segmentation to reduce shared exposure. You also avoid exaggeration, such as claiming passwords were stolen without evidence, because relay can create impact without classic credential theft.
Clear reporting turns a confusing security story into a concrete hardening plan.
To keep the concept sticky, use this memory phrase: name request, spoof answer, relay off, control.
Name request reminds you that the chain begins when a device asks for directions to a name it wants to reach.
Spoof answer reminds you that an attacker can answer first and redirect that request to the wrong destination. Relay auth reminds you that an attacker can forward authentication to a real service and gain access without necessarily learning the password.
Control reminds you that segmentation, hardening, and strong signing requirements reduce the opportunity for these behaviors to succeed.
When you hold this phrase, you can map observed symptoms back to the underlying trust chain quickly.
To conclude episode 55, titled Name Resolution and Relay Concepts, remember that these attacks thrive in environments where name resolution is messy and authentication trusts too much by default. Your job is to recognize signals, validate safely through traffic and policy evidence, and recommend controls that reduce ambient trust and prevent unintended authentication. Spoofing is when an attacker provides the wrong name resolution answer to redirect a request, while relay is when the attacker forwards a victim's authentication to a real service to gain access. That one-sentence distinction is the mental pivot that keeps analysis clean when logs look confusing. When you combine that distinction with segmentation and stronger signing and validation requirements, you significantly reduce the chance that simple "who has the directions" confusion becomes a credential and access problem.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.